Star Wars Tabletop Gaming is proudly supported by Gatekeeper Games, your key to gaming unplugged, a tabletop games store offering a friendly atmosphere for people to buy and play their games in the north of Fitzroy. Welcome to the second step of Star Wars Tabletop Gaming's 15th episode on how to build your very own desert-themed building. So in step 2 today, we're going to be looking at texturing the building to make it look more interesting and to give it that kind of mud hut, desert Tatooine look that's so famous from the movies. Gives it depth. It means that when we put a wash over it, it's going to get into nooks and crannies and just make the whole thing look more interesting. If you look on the example here, if you look really close, you can see there's kind of rough edges, smoother bits, all kind of stuff going on that just makes it a lot nicer to look at when it's on the table. So the things that you're going to need for this step are your filler. It doesn't have to be timber filler. It can be something a little cheaper. Comes in a tub. Name is escaping me right now, but there's lots of options. Essentially, you just need something to lather onto your piece of terrain. Didn't say miniature, almost did. You're going to need a brush that you don't care too much about, but make sure that the bristles of the brush aren't coming off, because that'll make your job a lot more difficult as you have to pick them out and it'll ruin the finish that we're trying to go for. Next, you'll need a sponge. It can be any kind of sponge, but you want it to have the two sides, the smoother side and the rougher side for adding that texture and breaking the smoothness up on the piece of terrain. And lastly, just any container that you're happy to get wrecked to put the timber filler into, because we're going to mix it with water to get the right consistency. Alrighty, let's filler this piece of terrain up. The first step to filling our building is to mix the filler with water. So the consistency you're looking for here is kind of like glue, or slightly thicker than glue. It'll take some time to get. You might have to play around, add some more filler, add some more water, and it actually takes, as you can see, a significant amount of mixing for it to actually break down and dissolve in, mix in, whatever you want to call it, with the water. But there's the consistency you're looking for. If you watch it drip down the side there, it's that thicker than glue consistency. It looks really liquidy, I know, but that's what you want, because as you're putting it on, you're leaving it to dry before you start taking your sponge to it, as you'll see here. So we start applying it to our roof and to the piece of terrain in general. What you're looking to do is put it on quite thick and put it on in a really nice covering as well over that cork. Cork especially, because the cork will absorb the spray paint. So I didn't really want to cover it because I wanted those little holes in there, but that wouldn't paint well. So I've covered it just for painting's sake. So if you have a look, you can see that's quite thick on there. When I say quite thick, we're talking, a couple of mil, but more so than just a brushing. You're not painting it. You're doing a dabbing kind of effect to get a thick layer on there. This one especially, I've gone really thick in those corners to make sure they kind of fill in and don't look like hard corners as such, look like more of a raising or whatever. But depending on different areas of the miniature, you want thicker bits and thinner bits, and you want to mix it up. I keep saying miniature, piece of terrain, building, let's say building. And you want to mix it up as well. You'll want some bits thicker and more rough and detailed, and you want some bits thinner. So if there's a bit of wood showing through, don't stress out. The effect in the end will look really good. So because I'm putting it on thicker on this roof bit, this is going to take longer to dry. So it's not a hard science on how long you want to leave it to dry before you start applying the sponge to it. It'll depend on how thickly you've put it on, the temperature of the day, what kind of effect you're looking for, all kinds of different things come into it. I'm working in my garage, which is quite a warm space. It's probably 30 degrees out there. It's beautiful here in Melbourne. So these don't take too long to dry, but we're still talking a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes before I wanted to take the sponge to it. So keep that in mind. What you're looking for as you're dabbing it on here, so now onto the main building, is not to cover up that terrain, those MDF detailed pieces. So I'm going around them as opposed to over them, and little bits that I'm getting on there, because I'm using quite a big brush, I'm just wiping off with my finger. You're going to get pretty messy, and that's just fine. So covering it nice and thickly. As you can see, some bits thicker than others. Mounds here and there. Make sure you get the sides and the top as well, or the corners I should say, and the top of the roof there. You want it all covered, everything except the detail. You want to get into all the corners, later on, I won't show it to you, but I cover those courtyard walls as well. I try and avoid the door here, and I try and avoid those detail pieces up the top. That was me just testing the roof there to see if it's dry enough yet. It was not. I try to avoid these details up the top as much as possible, but I wasn't overly successful due to the size of my brush. You could move down to a smaller brush and get in amongst it, but I'm lazy. But that's all right. I actually got in there with my scalpel later on and tried to dig out that detail a little, just so it shows through when the painting and the washing happens. So there I am, covering it all. I don't bother doing the base of the courtyard because I'm going to put sand over that later on, so there's no point. So it's all about doing it in stages. So while one part's drying, you're brushing on other parts, and while you're then sponging the other parts, this bit's drying. So it's about using efficiency of time and making sure you're not just waiting for things to dry. You can see there I start doing the tops. You want to make sure you're dabbing onto there as well so it doesn't look like it's a hard edge up the top. It looks a little rounded. All right, the sponge. So the sponge you want to use has to be dry. That's really important. And as you're working with it, keep kind of wiping it and even washing it or moving to a different brush, because different sponge, I should say, because you want it dry. There you go. I'm showing you the thickness there. Because that dry sponge is what's going to try and it's kind of going to catch as you go. You're not looking to have a smooth effect. You're looking to catch bits and drag it across. So the pressure that you're putting down with that sponge is quite light, because you want to drag the thicker bits over some of the thinner bits. That gives it that kind of mud wiped over effect. Yeah, so you can see quite light, little feathery touches to the side, and go in one direction as well if you can. Keeps it looking more standard and more realistic, I guess. See, I'm wiping it off there because you want it quite dry. And then I use the other side and I dab. You can dab firmly, you can dab softly, different areas. You want to kind of pick the thicker filler areas to do this, so you get more texture and more interesting effects. You want it quite dry when you're doing this. Otherwise, if it's wet, it'll kind of just disappear. The liquid will seep back and it won't stand out as much. So I actually come back a few times throughout this project and do those roof parts again. So come back to your project, to your bits that you've already wiped or sponged a few times to get different levels of texture as well. The drier it is, the better that green side of that sponge will show up the detail and give it that rough effect. But if it's too dry, of course, it won't do anything, because it will have already hardened. And we're talking the difference between a few minutes here. So you'll get a feel for it the more you do it. But it's not overly difficult. You just lightly wipe to the side and then press down with the green bit. I start moving on to the main building here. You can see that I've got in beforehand in the bit that I cut and covered pretty much the rest of the building. Another point here, you want to really make sure you cover the top bits down to where the roof struts are, because that's anything that's going to be visible once those roofs are on to the players. You want to cover in this texture. There you go. There's that dabbing effect in the thicker areas of that filler. Not difficult, but it's a bit of an art, and you'll get used to it eventually. All right, now we move on to the sand. So I like to have a bit of sand in my courtyard because I think it'd look weird if it was just that flat kind of cardboard. You could maybe put some tiles in there, do something a bit interesting. You would have seen there, those are the bits from the cork that I cut off when I was making it look a bit damaged. And I like to put these in the corner of the courtyard to make it look like a bit of a build-up of debris or detritus, whatever you want to call it. So chuck some glue in the corners there and just slam those cork bits in. And that'll break it up a bit so it's not just sand. You could get really interesting and put other bits of debris in amongst the courtyard, maybe a broken down droid or a bit of broken masonry or building or who knows what. You could get really creative if you wanted to. I'm keeping these nice and simple as a demonstration of the simplest effect and what that can have on the table, but you could get really creative. So putting on a whole bunch of wood glue and then just spreading it around with a brush. Kind of wherever you want it. I've decided with this one that the wind has blown in through the courtyard and kind of pushed the sand back into the edges and back into the main area and away from the entrance. Whereas in some of my other pieces, like the one on the left there, I've put more sand in the entrance area. Mix it up, whatever, should be right. And then just sprinkle the sand on. Do this rather than tipping a whole bunch of sand on. You're trying to avoid getting the sand on your filler, especially if some of that filler is still wet. You should really wait until the filler's dry, but I'm super impatient. So I was trying to avoid the sand getting on that wet filler as much as possible, because sand going up the wall doesn't make as much sense. And there we have it. Step 2 is complete. We have textured our building and we have applied sand to the courtyard. So, give you just a quick look at everything there. That looks cool. But in the end, I had to do that a few times because it kept being too wet because of all the filler that I shoved on there to try and get rid of those stark corners. I think that worked really well, that piece. We'll put it on in a minute and see what it looks like with the antenna connected in there. This piece looks really great. Once again, I had to go over that a second time with the rough edge there because it was a bit too wet when I did it the first time. But the key is just to keep going around, keep doing things, going over bits that you've messed up. I mean, if you really wanted to, you could sand this all back and have another go, or just fill it right over the top with any areas that you're not super happy with. But this should be just fine. And essentially that's just going to make it look a lot more interesting and a lot more exciting when we paint it up and give it that mud hut kind of feel. And that side as well. Yeah, nice. I left the bits in amongst the ladder bare. I didn't try and get filler in there. It would have just ruined the detail on the ladder. I'll get some wash in there when I paint it, and that should look absolutely fine. In regards to these roof bits, the roof won't sit very cleanly if you have little build-ups like that. So I'll get in there with, I don't know, maybe a little extra bit, an offcut, and dig that out, just so the roof sits nice and flush. So let's test it out. All right, so this has to go on here. All right, very good. Let's see if that still fits nicely. Yep, perfect. All right, here we go. Remember the truth. Perfect. So, because we now have filler on those edges, that roof's not going to go down too cleanly. So I'll have to get in there with some sandpaper or a knife. Just my scalpel scraping will probably do it, and scrape right at those edges just so that sits nice and flush again. Does this one up here sit? Whoop. Doing this one-handed. There we go. That one sits nicely. The end of the world, it is not. I'll come back in a second when I've cleaned that bit out. All completed, all fixed to make sure it actually fits. I got in there with my scalpel and just scraped around the edges of the top there, and also on the roof struts themselves to make sure that roof sits nice and flush. I think that building looks excellent. The filler does all kinds of things for the piece of terrain, especially though it covers these little gaps, these little joins here on the Tabula Rasa range too, which just gives it a much nicer finish. So it looks far more realistic on the table rather than just some MDF terrain that you've slapped down. So hopefully this step 2 of the desert building tutorial has been helpful. You've enjoyed it. In step 3, I'll show you how to paint your building, as well as do the staining and the washing as well, and all the painting of that detail. It'll be a bit longer, but it should be good. So thank you very much for watching, and we'll catch you next time.